we're going to talk about this morning. My name's Susan Alcorn, and I'm the coordinator for today's forum. And the title is The Intersection of Guns, Suicide, and Violence. What's next? Given this subject, I had some newspapers here with headlines. I don't know what happened to them. Anyway, you've seen the big headlines about the gun society and so forth. So that's all right. We're just in that era where things are happening. No, I don't.
It's not too helpful.
That's well, it's in the headlines, and it's really an actionable time. So we do want to challenge you with new information on this subject that you'll continue to think about and maybe even act on. We do have a mission in this church to search and to serve. We believe in the continuing search for truth and the importance of serving others. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all who attend. We chose today's topic for discussion because we're at really a crossroads in this issue. Nationally, 96 people are killed by guns every day, over 35,000 annually. Suicides account for over half of all gun deaths. It's time to look at the current laws and policies regarding guns and ask ourselves several things about what we can do, whether it's legislation to reduce gun violence, whether it's corporate and business policies or individual commitments, or by innovation from a variety of sources. Those are the things we need to discuss. But before we begin, I want to mention that we have a table there in the back with Sue Lafferty from Ohioans for Gun Safety. They are collecting signatures for a statewide petition that calls for expanded background checks for gun purchases and transfers. Their goal is to collect 265,000 signatures statewide for the November election. So I wanted to call attention to that. I'd now like to introduce Rosetta Craig. She's the moderator here for our forum, and she's the official gun control spokesman and lobbyist for the League of Women Voters of Ohio. A passionate advocate for gun control, she feels that the implementation of common sense gun laws is essential to reduce the gun violence that we're all experiencing. In 1999, her daughter's friend, a 15-year-old student, was gunned down by a jilted 21-year-old assailant. He had purchased a pistol at a gun show, and despite a history of mental illness and a court record, that's what happened. Since then, Rosetta has attended many legislative committee hearings and has testified before the Ohio General Assembly and against concealed carry weapons and many other issues. And so I now turn it over to Rosetta. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I on? I also would like to make a plug for the Ohio Coalition Against Gun Violence. They've been my heart and soul and my support for understanding the problems of gun violence prevention. And I'm kicking myself now because I forgot to bring the brochures. But anyway, keep them in mind too. A broad public health epidemic of crisis proportions. There is no one-dimensional approach that we can take and think that it's going to solve the problem. Crime throughout the state. Dr. Dunn has served on a statewide advisory board on community Board of Commissioners. He's also a member of the Cleveland NAACP and social issues, including the reduction of violence throughout our community. Sitting next to him is Michael Walker, Executive Director of the Partnership for a Safer Cleveland, and he has created many innovative programs to prevent and reduce violence in the greater Cleveland areas. He's also the Project Director for the U.S. Attorney's Northern District of Ohio's comprehensive anti-violence initiative named STANCE, S-T-A-N-C-E, Stand Together Against Neighborhood Crime Every Day. As a result of his work, Michael has been twice recognized as the Volunteer of the Year award from the National Association of Social Workers for the state of Ohio. He's also been featured on NBC's The Today Show and CBS's Eyes on America. And next to me is Dr. Jane Timmons-Mitchell. She is an Associate Clinical Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at CWRU Case's School of Medicine. She's also a Senior Research Associate at Case Bacon's Center for Violence centers on preventing gun violence from 3 sources.
To be here this morning with this distinguished panelists this morning talking about this very important and critical issue of gun violence in our society. As we know, the U.S., as Rosetta stated, we're at a crisis situation, not only relative to gun violence, but as I was thinking about it, we also, we lead the world in possession and ownership of guns as well as gun violence, having 1.2 guns per person in the country, 390 million guns in our country. So more than 1 gun for each individual in our society. We also lead the world in incarceration of our citizens. So as I thought about this, I'm thinking, where are the intersections and what's the commonalities there? And for me, being a race scholar, race was very salient when I looked at that factor. African Americans are most likely to be the victims of gun violence. And when we look at this current moment in our nation's history and where we are relative to the possession of guns and this gun crisis we're in, we know it hasn't just started. Urban gun violence has been persistent for decades, but yet we haven't had this type of national outcry as a result of that, and really it wasn't until, I would say, Sandy Hook that we began to then marry the urban gun violence with this issue of these mass shootings. So we can't overlook the relevance of race in these discussions as well. And actually, as I was thinking about it, and when Susan and I were discussing on the conference call, it came to me that we don't even debate the Second Amendment and the interpretation of it anymore. It's like a settled case law that is written that you have the right to bear arms as an individual. So in essence, as I see it, we've abandoned that argument to the right. And thus we're at this moment now where we're acquiescing. So with that being said, I think that is one area, just like they're now going back and challenging Ray v. Roe. I would suggest that's an area that the left and progressives need to once again become more vocal on. The majority of Americans are in support of stricter gun laws, gun control laws. But within that, the youth, the young, those between 18 and 29 are less supportive of the right to bear arms. And they also are less likely to own guns. So if we think about the Parkland shooting and the mass movement and protests led by those young people, for me, that presents some hope and optimism that there is a tide that can shift this political moment and arena that we're in. So, I could go on. I have several notes and thoughts on this issue, but at this point, I'm going to pass it to Mike.
My next.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. So again, thank you to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland for convening this forum. We appreciate your interest and are glad to be here. So I'm just going to run through some, to connect to what Ronnie was saying. I want to now connect it to suicides and run through some statistics related to gun violence and suicide. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have indicated that intentional self-harm, that's how they categorize suicide, accounted for 47,173 deaths in the United States in 2017. You know, there's this issue about lag of statistics, and that's the last one that we have. It was the 10th leading cause of death overall. This, I think, is important because if you think about what the other causes of death are and what we've done to try to address them, you know, things like used to just, you know, take people out immediately, and of course they do the research that will be effective to come up with new treatments. And when it comes to suicide, we know some things to do, but in terms of cause of death for people in the age 10 to 24 bracket, accounting for 19.2% of the deaths. And it's knowledgeable when we address, you know, our congressional representatives and others. Okay, so in 2018, there's something called the Gun Violence Archive. This is convened, Michael Bloomberg has funded a number of initiatives to try to supplant and extend the work of the CDC because of their being hampered by congressional funding restrictions. So the Gun Violence Archive says that there were 39,773 gun deaths in 2018, and of these, over 25,000 were suicides, which is an increase over the previous year. So here's the thing. Overall, gun deaths are decreasing, but gun deaths from suicide are increasing. We should be very worried. There's something called the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. This is a national group of it's policymakers, researchers, and they come together and they put out recommendations. So they have come up with recommended care for people at risk of suicide, and they recommend part of this is assessing for access to lethal means, of which guns are the most lethal means. And I'll tell you how we know that. There's a website called meansmatter.org, which you can look up. It's really fascinating. It's part of the T.H. Chan Harvard School of Public Health. And so this is all about guns and suicide. And what they have found is that guns are the most lethal means, and that 85% of people who use guns in a suicide attempt die by suicide. And 85% of people who do not use guns in a suicide attempt do not. And then, if you hook that to our prevention efforts, those people who use other means and who do not die can be hooked to effective prevention efforts, because we have a lot of those. So, you know, there used to be this myth, and it's just not true, that if somebody is attempting suicide, well, it doesn't matter, you don't have to really get them connected because they're going to find a way to complete anyway. That's not true. We have all this good data that if you connect people. So people who die by suicide are more likely to live in homes with guns. And in particular, remember that statistic about youth? It's so alarming. Youth who die by suicide use a gun most often, it's 82% of the time, a gun belonging to a family member. There is an ER doc in Columbus who has done some really fascinating work, and he went to parents and he asked parents of kids who were coming into the ER with gunshots of any kind, and he asked the parents if they had a gun. And the parents who said yes, he said, you know, how do you have it stored? And so he recorded that. And then his final question was, do you think your kids know where the gun is and how to get access to it? And the parents overwhelmingly said, no, they don't know. And the kids overwhelmingly said, yes. because that's how they had access to, I mean, it's, you know, what we don't know is really gonna hurt us, okay. If a person, okay, and finally, the National Lifeline, which you can all find by just, you know, looking up National Lifeline, is 1-800-273-8255. You can look it up, it's all over the place, 1-800-273-8255. If you know anybody who is, you know, just feeling blue, just even saying something in passing. Because what happens if somebody calls the National Lifeline is that they get connected with people in their area. In Cuyahoga County, it's Frontline Services. And they do a really active triage, and they can go out and find people if they need to, you know, talk to you in person. It's a really effective system, it works. But trying to separate people who are suicidal from guns is a really good idea. The FCC is now working on, I think this would be great, they're working on simplifying, because, you know, looking up that number is not the easiest thing to do if you're, or if somebody's in the middle of a crisis. They're thinking of going to a system where we have a 3-digit number, you know, like we have for 911. So the number they're proposing is 988. So stay on top of that, because that could be some really good news. If it comes out in the next few months that they've gone to this 3-digit number, that would be another good step, good public health, you know, universal prevention, make it easier. So I guess, besides throwing a bunch of statistics at you, what I wanted to say is that, you know, it's pretty clear that suicide is a big problem. It's increasing, and one of the reasons it's increasing, a big reason it's increasing, is because of all of the access to all of the guns that are every place. Finally, I guess I could say something about ideas to help improve, and I know we'll say more about that. I was in Australia this summer visiting friends, and people in Australia, people in the rest of the world think we are nuts. They look at us and they're like, what is wrong with you? You know, just because, I mean, in other countries, in Australia, famously 30 years ago, well, we'll get into that, but you know, they look at this and they limit it. They're like, why should more wonderful things that we can do a lot. But when it comes to suicide, it's really easy to prevent. Just, you know, if you see something, say something, and hopefully try to disconnect people who are suicidal from the presence of a gun.
The great joy is all of you being here. We've lost discourse and conversation. Because what I'm going to do real briefly is just give you an analogy. If you are cold, you bring a sweater or a blanket or a quilt. And a quilt can have many patches until you've already just heard. The despair that people have, and quilt together a way to provide warmth, caring. And so your mission one of the things that your congressional representatives will say, we don't know what works. That is not true. Around the world, besides New Zealand, Australia, everyone else has mental health challenges and depression, and guess what? Their rates of what we see are not the same. The one difference is accessibility to guns. How you want to define them, we can debate that. I'm just going to say is this. We're very blessed in Northeast Ohio. We have a U.S. attorney, we have an ATF office that really works tirelessly within the structures that they have, the limitations, to do a good job, but it's not good enough. And so what we'll talk about, and really we want to hear from you and have a conversation, is that there are things that can work and be better, but one of the things we need is to communicate those, and actionable actions by all of us will make the difference.
Okay, I usual. We've packed a lot of information in a short amount of time. We're going to pass the clipboards here around. Do we have the clipboards over here somewhere? Oh, here they are on my chair. We're going to pass those around, and if you want to receive continuing notifications of our community discussions and forums, sign your name and email, and we'll give you a reminder weekly. And we don't share your information with anyone else, so that's how we do it in terms of reminding people. Now, in terms of our discussion, there are 3 rules. One is the microphone holders choose the person asking the question. And the second rule is keep your questions short if possible. Look at how our forum speakers have done. They've done a wonderful job. And third, hold your microphone very close to your mouth so we can hear it. All of our forums are recorded on YouTube, and this makes a big difference, being able to hear all of the words that you or our speakers are saying. So, okay, thank you. Let's have the first question.
Good morning. I see a lady in the back who's collecting signatures for better background checks. This is just my personal opinion. I don't think that's going to help. I think what we really need to do is to ban those assault rifles. And no one seems to be talking about that. What can we do to get rid of them?
Rock is talking about it.
Do you want to respond to that? You can respond to that because I know there's...
Right. I would be happy to just throw in my 2 bits. I've been working on this since 2000. So I've been an advocate to prevent gun violence for the last 18 years. And what was said at the beginning of the forum, I would re-emphasize. Background checks will definitely help. Banning assault weapons will definitely help. Addressing suicide will definitely help. What we cannot have is people walking away from forums like this thinking that a one-dimensional approach is going to do the job. We have to do it all. Whenever you have a public health crisis epidemic, you don't just try to do one thing. You try to do it all. You have tiger teams that get together and think about this and think about that. We cannot have a one-dimensional approach, but everything will help.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Dunn?
Yes.
Yeah, so why no mention about gun violence by police, such as the 137 bullet barrage in East Cleveland by Cleveland Police in November of 2012?
Mm-hmm. You said why?
Gun violence by police, how can we deal with that?
Well, thank you for that question, and that's part of this broader discussion that we don't include violence by police as part of this discussion. It needs to be armed civilians died and if you read the Attorney General's report, that scene had already been inventoried when BCI took over, and it said at least 137 shots. So it might have been more. Given this current administration relative to police accountability and oversight and the regression that has occurred with the DOJ pattern and practice investigations, that pro-police position that this administration, and is really prevalent across the United States, where if you raise any type of critical questions relative to policing, you're going to get strong opposition, even from the majority of society, the mainstream. Even in the instance of those daily use of force, particularly against people of color, which the majority are, we give that benefit of the doubt to the law enforcement. So it's going to take a political movement and campaign and a groundswell of support to really begin to shift that needle. I don't see it in this current environment, and relative to, we're talking about gun control overall, incorporating the law enforcement component in that, I don't see feasible in the short term, but it should be raised as a critical issue. Just because, and going back to my earlier point, where we've ceded ground on the interpretation of the Second Amendment, the one thing I have to give the right, they stay consistent even when they aren't and have the majority of things aren't in their favor. They stay consistent on their positions until the tide shift. And I argue that's what the progressives need to do in this country as well. So I hope I gave some answer to your question.
Dr. Mitchell, could you tell us a little more about the rates of suicide by gun?
Yeah, the short answer is it's getting worse. And I think I gave some statistics about that. And I'd be happy to give more, but as I said, that website at the Harvard School of Public Health is pretty good for that. There are also lots of other good websites. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center is, so it's sprc.org, is a wealth of information. This is the Technical Assistance Center that's funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to provide technical assistance on all their suicide prevention projects. And if you kind of have to piece it together, and this is one of the things that I think is so frustrating, is the CDC has some information, you know, SPRC has some information, the Harvard School of Public Health has some information, but because, and I certainly want to echo what my colleagues are saying, there needs to be a push. And it's so easy, oh my goodness, to fund gun violence prevention research and to allow the CDC to keep statistics. I was delving into this, you know, and the CDC has amazing information. And they have this thing that they put out every week called the MMWR, right? The Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And you can look at for every week on, you know, 50 topics, but you get to the issue of, you can find out how many suicides there are, but when you get to the issue of what was used and whether it was guns, it's not there. You can look in, we've been doing through our project a deep dive into the NVDRS, which is the National Violent Death Reporting System. And it's a very interesting system where all deaths if a state buys in, so it's up to the state, all deaths in the state go to the CDC, and they go from 3 sources, and the Ohio Department of Health sort of compiles this information. So you've got the police report, you've got the coroner's report, and then I think the other one is it's a somewhat legislative thing, so it's kind of coming up with a conclusion. It's very interesting and very good data. The trouble is, since states have the option of buying in, only 27 states participate. So if you want to go to this national database and find out nationally, you know, do you have the right states? And as I said, it makes a difference what the gun laws are in that state, whether that state is going to give you representative information. So it's like you get to a place where, yes, you've got some information, but then there's a wall that comes down. Similarly, to your question about background checks, the research that we have is very clear that background checks do work. But if you dive into it, you get to a place eventually where you can't go any farther because of this wall coming down. There's a bill that's been passed in the House to extend the research funding for the CDC and to allow them to collect this information. It's extremely easy. Just add to what you're already doing. And it stopped like everything else. So I would just echo what Dr. Dunn said. Yeah, advocacy.
I have a question about prevention, and this is, I understand that we have the gun industry that's heavily supporting I understand that we have a gun industry that's heavily supporting various candidates and so on and so forth, so that they're not going to be in support of things have been passed by House and so on and so forth. But the other question I have in relation to that is, we have so many young people that are spending so much time with violent video gaming, and they're not reading, and there's, you know, this aberration of violence in general, and what can be done regulatory-wise to limit how much violence is being experienced by a younger person on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. So I'm going to start. I know that my colleagues will have some really good information, but I just. What do we do? This isn't. Can we use the other one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
One microphone.
Okay. We're going to try this one. That's better, right? Sorry. Okay. So you know, after the last round of mass shootings, you know, we go through the cycle. Okay. But in the cycle, two things were introduced that could be alternative causes: mental illness and violent video games. Both of which, in terms, we have 30 years of research on each, and it's just not true. Neither one of those cause gun violence in any way. The people that research violent video games were on NPR, and you could look up for this interview because it was really interesting. And they said, you know, we've researched this, we've researched it to death, but you get to a point in research where the question is settled. And they're like, we'd like to research something else, but the funding keeps going in that one direction, so they keep doing it. That's settled. And when it comes to mental illness, I know that isn't what you asked, but I'm just gonna address that too because it might come up. So here's the thing, people who are truly severely mentally ill are much more, like 90%, much more likely to be victims of gun violence than to engage in gun violence, for all the obvious reasons. And this is the intersection, I think, with background checks, which is that, so it's too simple to say we need background checks. We have a background check system, but there are issues with it, one of which is simply, again, funding to have enough person power to do the background checks in the time that's required. You may know, very famously, Dylan Roof, the shooter in the Charleston Emmanuel Church shooting, had a history of mental illness, should have been prevented in a background check from being able to purchase the weapon that he used in that shooting. But because the time expired, there's a 3-day waiting period, the time expired because there weren't enough people available to process the request to get it into the database to put the hold on his purchasing the firearm. So, you know, it's like when you get down into the details, there are lots of things, and people say this a lot. People say, well, we could do this. You know, why do we need additional legislation? It's like, well, we could do it, but we're not doing it. And so, you know, my vote would be, let's do the legislation because that will hopefully come with some funding, and then hopefully people will be able to implement, you know, the systems that we have. But really, you know, of course we should curb youth access to violence, and these two gentlemen do wonderful work, and there is an army of people doing that work, in addition to the army of people that's doing prevention. But the issues of, you know, mental illness and violent video games causing gun violence have been debunked seriously, and so we should focus elsewhere. We should focus where the issue is.
I would just like to, if I could, just because again, I think Jane has really put it on the table. How many of you remember Bugs Bunny? Okay. Elmo Fudd. Okay. Top Cat, Road Runner. Okay. The difference some people have said is this is so much more realistic, Michael. And you go, but it's still accessibility to the weapons.
Yes.
And so, yes, we understand it. Yes, there need to be restrictions. However, let's don't forget, we need to keep our eyes on the prize and be very purposeful, because splitting us up, and I think Dr. Dunn and Ronnie, I'm sorry, Dr. Dunn and Ronnie, is said the following statement. You know, we've kind of allowed the right to be very focused, no matter how unjustified it is, and yet everyone else worries that we always got to prove that we're being fair and balanced. Please, no. I'm going to ask you.
Yes, going back to Mike's earlier point, to pick up on the point that Jane raised relative to the violence of videos, those videos aren't only in the United States,
Right.
they're around the world. And we don't see that these levels of violence, Japan, China, they have very robust video gaming cultures as well, but we don't see the levels of violence there as well. So once again, it definitely goes to the access to guns. And relative to the mental health component, I've always been taken by the fact that it's always after the fact that they say this person had mental health issues. If we think about this obsession about gun ownership, you know, I'm really stuck with the Second Amendment, truthfully I am. Not only the interpretation, but the origins of it, and then also this obsession with gun ownership. Why, and the stand your ground laws, and obviously there's this threat. I feel threatened. My life is being threatened, thus I need this weapon for self-defense. Well, to me, that almost, it hinges on paranoia. If you feel you have to be armed every second of the day, armed to the gill, and the paranoia is a diagnosis of mental health. So to me, that's the mental health issue that we aren't raising, we aren't talking about. Why do you, who is it that you feel threatened of? Now that's when we have to go back and talk about, look at these mass shootings, Charleston, El Paso, so many of, we've seen an increase in hate crime incidents against people of color, minorities, immigrants, people that are perceived to be immigrants. So once again, who are we afraid of? Who poses this threat? And I failed to mention in my initial comments that gun ownership, while is less prevalent among the young, those between 18 and 29, is more prevalent among those 50 and above, particularly white males. So who is it white males feel threatened by?
Other white males.
No, I don't think so. So really it's a matter of social control. We have to think about that. Go back to the Second Amendment, the Constitution. Who is it written by and for? White men, not women, not minorities. So let's keep all of this in mind. Put it in a social historical context. When we unpack these issues and try to address them, we have, it's important, critically important, that we do that.
But when the amendment was written, a lot of
What percentage of the
guns
deaths
didn't
are
exist.
Okay, we have two separate questions.
Excuse me, we have to keep, wait until the people come around and tap on your shoulder or wave to you and say, okay, now it's your turn. And this is what is so wonderful about this discussion. We have to remember, though, that this is a place for us to learn, not a place for us to express our opinions. Everybody has opinions, but oftentimes when people get to the microphone, they get excited and they start expressing opinions, then we stop learning. And this is a very precious time for learning. So please remember, raise your hand, wait for somebody to come around, and wait for yourself to be called on to ask the question.
All right, I'll be brief. What percentage of the deaths of suicide are occurring with high school or college age students? And is any effort made on the part of those institutions where the children are growing up? Is there any effort to talk about this with the students?
Yeah, so, right, so it's 20% of the young people are dying by suicide. What percent of those are guns? I know this because we've done it in our Ohio data, and it's less than half. It's a lower number than people overall, I think partly because of access. But in terms of prevention efforts, yes, the prevention efforts are amazing. So one of the things that I do, I serve as the evaluator for the State Suicide Prevention Grant, which goes to the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation. This is part of a program. It's a national program. You can look it up on the SAMHSA website. It's part of the GLS grants. GLS stands for Garrett Lee Smith. Garrett Lee Smith was the son of a senator who died by suicide when he was in college. And so his dad, the senator, formulated this legislation, which has extended to every state and most tribal communities. And the funding is pretty secure because, you know, you can't count on much in the Senate, but you can count on them funding legislation that was named for the son of a member of their body. And the prevention efforts are amazing. If you want to find out what's going on nationally, you can go to the sprc.org that I mentioned before. It's a very dense website. It's hard to navigate it because there's so much. If you want to find out what's going on in Ohio, you can go to the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, which is ospf.org. And it's stratified in terms of all the things. And I think it would be beyond the scope and take too much of everybody else's time to tell you what exactly is going on. But there are efforts that are targeted at youth. There are efforts that are targeted at families. There are efforts that are targeted at educators in all schools in Ohio. Training is available. And also for communities at the community level. There's an awful lot going on. But as you can see, because suicide is increasing in this age group, we need to keep doing it, and we need to keep doing more.
Who's coming around?
I have the microphone.
You have the microphone. Okay, please come.
Ms. Craig mentioned the importance of operating on many different fronts. I find it really interesting that the NRA has not been mentioned in this conversation, and I'm wondering whether, well, I actually have 10 questions. I'm going to try to cram it into one incoherent one. Is one of the strategies, one of their strategies, trying to divide us by race in order to keep us separated? And if so, how do we counter that and present one unified human voice? And is there an opportunity in Dr. Dunn's upcoming wonderful, I'm going to do a promo for your Project 400. I went quickly looking to see if there was a specific gun violence workshop, but I wanted to make sure you mentioned that this is another opportunity for us, hopefully. Group context.
Yes, thank you for that, Ms. Budish. As Amy mentioned, we're hosting a two-day conference at Cleveland State entitled Project 400. It's the kickoff of a year-long observation of the arrival of the first Africans in what is now the U.S. in 1619. And it's going to be held on September 27th and 28th at the Woolstein Center. It's free and open to the public, and Dr. Henry Louis Gates will be our keynote speaker on the morning of the 27th. His comments will start at 9 o'clock. So, and once again, it is just the beginning of a year-long community-wide engagement around issues relative to the African American experience in the U.S. We do have 4 tracks for the conference: criminal justice, health disparities, education, and economics. I don't think there's a session specific to gun violence. I'm not sure. I'll have to look back at the itinerary. But it's on our website, and please forgive me, I meant to bring postcards or hand announcements for the conference this morning. When you ask the question, are they trying to divide us along racial lines, are you referring to the NRA or whom?
The NRA and the groups affiliated with them about our constitutional rights.
Well,
on that? And also, the issue, why is it that in our state legislature, guns are not allowed?
True,
Right.
yeah,
Right,
I
right,
saw that.
right.
But they want to allow them
You go
on
down-
college campuses.
Right.
They want guns everywhere except in the legislature. So yeah, very hypocritical. Well, and you raise a very good point. The NRA is silent on the right to bear arms for minorities, people of color. Think of the Philandro Castile case in Minnesota, Milwaukee, was it? Yeah. The young man that was shot in the car, he had a CCW, and he informed the officer that he had his weapon, yet and still he was shot and killed. They don't speak out on the right to bear arms there. Even here locally, there was a case where a young man of a former councilwoman was shot with a CCW, and he informed the police that he had it. I myself, I know as an African American male, and as of 2016, I now have a CCW. Prior to that, I was opposed to owning a gun. But given this current political environment and everything that's going on, I said, well, even though I have it, I don't carry. I'm just sharing. Well, now it's on YouTube. Everyone knows. Everybody knows. But that was a very enlightening process for me. I know as an African American male, I don't have the same right and protections, even with that, as my white counterparts might. And going through that process of going through the background check, it was very enlightening for me, because now when you think of the mass incarceration and it's disproportionately African Americans in our criminal justice system. If you're precluded from owning a weapon or possessing a firearm because you have a felony, think of the number of African Americans that are automatically disqualified. And yet they live in some of the most violent communities in the country. So is my life any less valuable than someone else's, even if I have a felony? What's the first first law of humanity? Self-preservation, right? So even if I needed for protection in the neighborhoods or communities that I live in, that's questions that we as a community and society have to consider, and I don't think we are.
I just want to answer real quick to your comment about carrying in the State House. I attended the hearings for concealed carry weapons legislation in 2002.
Get rid of that.
So I attended the hearings in the State House prior to 2004. 2004 was when the concealed carry weapons licensing system was implemented in Ohio. So I attended hearings 2002, 2003, and up until 3 weeks before the passage of the bill, there was a clause in there that it out. They claimed it was because they didn't want to take over the job from the highway patrol. I don't believe it.
I love it. Good job. Yeah, right.
They thought they'd kill each other?
Okay. Right.
Just trivia.
This is personally a very emotional issue for me, so I'm going to try and hold it together. I'd like to know, first of all, if you can compile a list of things that we can be active in, so that we can get more directly involved. Also, I feel like we should be all calling our legislators every day to say, we will not send you $1 if you do not support changes in gun ownership and laws in this country. And I guess that's all I want to say.
People are looking at me. Okay, that's the hardest question that I'm asked on a continuing, ongoing basis. The problem is that it's a broad topic. The circumstances around every gun death, the circumstances around every mass shooting, they're all different. And what they have in common is the gun. I personally feel that we cannot break this cycle unless we can do something about the legislation. But meanwhile, if we break the cycle through the legislation, we still have a big job to do. Because as we said, there's more guns in this country than we have people. I also have thought a lot about this because I've been involved in this for 18 years. It's very discouraging. Okay, it's been very discouraging. I say, why do I continue? What have I accomplished in these 18 years? But I also realize that there's a satisfaction where my passions are and where my abilities are. So for example, I'm not real good at fundraising. I get very frustrated with phone calls and having to get people to a fundraiser. On the other hand, I'm an engineer by background, and for me to go in front of the state legislature and make a point and try to engage them and make them mad at me and try to engage in debate, that I like. So before I can answer that question of what you can do, you have to become educated on the problem and look inward and say, what am I going to be good at? What am I going to be doing something that I can do without feeling, that fits me, that suits me. You know, it's just like you don't want to put on a sweatshirt that's too small or too big. You need to become educated about this problem and then look where your talents and skills and aspirations fit the best. Again, staying in touch with your legislatures is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the work you're all doing. I have one question I'd like each person to address, however. Just wondering if your organization is in, I'm sure you're in contact with them all, but I'd like to know what you know about the positions and from both Marcia Fudge, but especially David Joyce on the east side, because I think we should be putting together groups to go out and especially talk to him. But what do you know about the legislators for this county that we should know?
So one of the things, I think one of the answers about what you can do is to actively contact your legislators all the time. And if you hook into any of the groups that are active, I mean, I get all these listserv things, but sometimes they're helpful because they give you these updates. The Ohio this is legislation that's going on. Then Everytown, Brady, moms, join moms. Moms demand action against gun violence. Get a yeah, okay. I was just kind of trying to incorporate some of the previous. But Marcia Fudge, I know because I've contacted directly. So this is under the heading of I've contacted all the legislators frequently. Marcia Fudge sends wonderful personal letters. Is fantastic and is all shooting where people the next day were I think be in the column you want to be in.
I'll just echo the same thing. We're really getting good support from Marcia, and we get great support from Sherrod. The challenges dealing with both John and Portman is that you, all of us, because they're not my particular, need to contact them. DeWine was moved because the community wanted action. And he has taken a lot of personal flack from other Republican governors and also 45 because there are roadblocks, the funding for the CDC, the legislation. Think about this. There are 435 people who simply tomorrow could change the whole access to gun situation regardless of what's in the Constitution. They just have to act.
There's, I don't know the specific positions of Portman and David Joyce, but to echo my colleagues here, I do know once again, advocacy, lobbying, going to at this 18 years, I compare to top 2000s advocating for reducing the sentencing Washington on those lobbying days. And it's been a 20-year process, but we finally got reform on at least the sentencing disparities piece. The racial profiling, that's still an ongoing battle. So once again, going back to my earlier comments about being persistent on issues and the way to go.
Hi. I have a story and then a question. And elementary school. And I go into the homes of the kids I was playing with, and there would always be a rifle above the stove. And that was part of the culture. It really was. And the rifles were clearly used for hunting. And a second way to underline that, my dad worked for the railroad, and he had to get crews together for coal mining to get the coal loaded on the cars and so forth. He could never get a crew together on the first day of hunting season. Absolutely. The railroad literally shut down. That was how important hunting was to that culture. So we have to deal with that. It's not as simplistic now as it was then with all the media we have, and I still am concerned about social media and the way that influences young people and many others who want to gain some kind of recognition for whatever they say or do on social media. But that's freedom of speech, and so that's not as easy to do. I want to also bring up the retailers. Walmart has announced that they will no longer sell ammunition nor assault-style rifles. And there was an article that I read that something like 157 different major corporations were also taking some kind of action at the sale level. Not all of them certainly sold rifles and so forth, but these were supportive of gun control on some level in terms of violence. So I'd like to get some ideas for us as we think through these things. We've covered government and so forth. What can we do about the stores in our community? Some have posted, we don't permit guns in this store. But what other areas are ripe for development in this retail establishment?
I'll take a step. I'll take a
First of all, related to hunting, what most people need to realize is that the pro-gun control, anti-gun violence agenda is not targeted towards hunters, okay? What most hunters will tell you, you need two bullets in your rifle. One to shoot the animal, and the other if you miss. And if you need more than 2 bullets, you shouldn't be hunting. Right. Now that has been told to me. Also, there is nothing that would prevent what we're asking for in the platforms that we've had, and the platforms have very actually quite little over the last 20 years that I've been involved. We're asking for not confiscation. We're asking for guns. Hunting is alive and well in Germany. I've been there, but it takes about a year to become certified, to have a gun, to have a license to buy a gun, and you have to pay a fairly expensive membership in a hunting club. Now, Canada, the process of getting a license to buy a gun is about 30 days. We are not asking to take guns away from the hunters. We do, though, want to remind people that anytime there's a gun in the house, as Jane mentioned, you may be having access to shoot that squirrel for dinner, for those pies your grandma used to make. On the other hand, you also could be leaving lethal means for your disturbed 13-year-old to kill himself.
Hi, I think this is a complex question, but I would like somebody to take a stab at it. With the last shooting in a school system, my son said to me, I'm the first generation of kids to go through school that knew that we could die in school. Could you tell me what school systems and parents, other than not having a gun, school systems could do to help the children feel safe when they're in school? Because he's in college now, but I didn't know that he felt unsafe. And when I polled his friends, I said, did you feel unsafe every day when you went to school? They told me, not every day. But when there would be a shooting and they would hear about it, of course they would feel unsafe and their nervous system would be triggered for weeks. So what kinds of things could we do with the schools?
So I agree it is a complex question. And I've heard that too. I've heard from friends who have kids who are just entering college now. And interestingly, a friend of mine would say to her daughters, because her daughters would like hair trigger, anxiety, and she would say to them, what's the difference? If something like that happened to me when I was your age, I would feel anxious, but I wouldn't have a full-blown attack. And they would say to her, Mom, it's because our whole lives we've had this in the back of our minds and also in the front because we've had to go through these drills. The drills, I understand the reason for them, but people are just beginning to do the research, to sum these anecdotal reports, and it looks like we are conditioning generations of children to have PTSD because of that worry. And so I completely agree with you. It is, I think it's something that needs to be a bigger focus than it has been. But in terms of the answer to what schools can do, schools actually are addressing this at the school level and at the policy level. There are a lot of really good plans. The Sandy Hook Promise people put together some really wonderful planning tools at the school level, and Sandy Hook Promise is active in Ohio. And they have, I think, some pilot programs going on, but you can look up on their website and find out what's entailed in those school level interventions. I think that if they were fully implemented, that would help quite a bit. At the parent level, and this is something I struggle with because, in clients that I work with, I'm hearing this too. And I think, reinforcing safety in an unsafe world is not a new idea. A lot of people have been dealing with it for a long time. As Ronnie said, the racial disparity, the health disparities for black families, have been dealing with this forever. So, how do we get around that? How do we deal with it? And, I'm not really sure. I think that it can be improved. I think that families can reinforce, whatever we do to help feel safe, to keep safe. Communities and faith communities, I think, are increasingly important. I think kids need to be connected back to faith communities, however that's defined. Then the other pieces have to do with having structured time. I think one of the things that happens in kids' lives these days is that there's this idea that they go to school, they come home, they turn on their screens, and they play their video games, and that's their existence. And that's not healthy. For kids or other living things, right? So what we know is that what kids should be doing is they should be involved in clubs, in sports. They shouldn't be coming and plopping down in front of screens. And you may say that's a far stretch, and I get that may be something. Any kind of activity that's school-based, yeah. I mean, these things, you talked about nervous system, and I am involved with some research at that level at the Cleveland Clinic. And you're absolutely right. But on the other hand, the arts, they have an arts institute, art and music have been shown to counteract those, even at the neurological level effects. And so,
we have guns that the technology is like from the 18th century. In other parts of the world, especially in Europe, there are smart guns, with either rings or fingerprint technology or other kinds of things. And we know that the NRA is basically an American gun manufacturer lobby, and they have put manufacturers out of business who have tried to bring smart gun technology to our country. And when you think about the things that have been in the news, like a toddler grabs his mom's gun in the shopping cart and shoots somebody, so much, and stealing and all, so much could be prevented. I'm curious your reaction or ideas of how we can support this notion of let's bring guns into the 21st century in our country.
Yes. Who would like to answer?
Oh, I love that's running in the Democratic process for president, and that's Yang. And he talks about something that's very true. The NRA has fought the technology because it's not a great business practice. The last thing I just say, think of automobile manufacturers, if they build cars that will last for 10 years. They would say to you that would be the dumbest business strategy around. And so in reality, this is really a business practice that says, we don't want smarter guns because less people will want to own them, and even though it would protect, because the technology proves that this has reduced around the world about a 40% reduction in accidental deaths.
Okay.
That was very
right. Let's give our answers and questions. We've had an excellent forum here. We've covered many different aspects of guns and violence. The forum we're having next week, and it's in your brochure, is on Facebook. That nearly 1.5 billion people use Facebook. And economically, Facebook profits exceed $21 billion per year. So how can it and other media giants be regulated? It's certainly a topic worth consideration. in 2 weeks, September 29th, Julia Bartel, Chief Clinical Officer of Hospice of the Western Reserve, will speak to us on an important subject, how we die. Nearly 60% of people die in hospitals. What are other ways we can plan for a peaceful death for ourselves and our loved ones? So, those are the upcoming forums. Our upstairs sermon today is titled, "Come Take My Friend Hand." I mean, come take my hand, friend. You have to get that right.
Yeah, Brad.
Certainly come up here to the table and talk with him. And I want to make sure that your name and email is on our forum reminder list, the clipboard that was passed around. And I also want to remind you that we have the Sue Cleric back in the area there on the table. But it talks about background checks. So anyway.